By isolating the variable here, we can see how the theorem applies. This derivation is essential for understanding the next section.
This equation is considered impossible to solve. Let's see what you can do.
A bright morning on campus, a gifted student steps into class with calm determination, unaware that he is walking straight into a carefully staged humiliation. An impossible challenge waits ahead, created not to teach, but to expose him, to test his dignity, to remind him of the prejudice that hides behind authority. The room tightens with silence, tension rising like a storm about to break, and in the next moments everything will change for everyone watching. If this moment already has you on edge, subscribe now and stay with the story.
He always began his mornings with quiet purpose, moving through the campus like someone who had learned to exist between worlds, present, focused, yet always aware of the invisible weight he carried. The walk across the courtyard felt familiar, the cool air brushing against his face, the rustle of notebooks inside his worn backpack, the distant hum of students beginning their day. To others, it was just another morning. To him, it was another step in a journey he had fought years to reach. A journey built on discipline, sacrifice, and a belief that knowledge could open doors the world once tried to keep closed. Yet even in these ordinary moments, there was always something else walking beside him, a quiet awareness shaped by experience, the understanding that every space he entered asked him to prove himself in ways others never had to. The campus looked peaceful in the early light, with tall buildings casting long shadows across the pathways, trees swaying gently in the breeze, and students moving through their routines without thought. But for him, peace was never just peace. It was something fragile, something easily disturbed, something that could shift without warning. From childhood, he had learned that excellence was not simply a goal, it was a shield. Every late night spent studying, every quiet hour lost in equations, every silent refusal to give up had been a promise to himself. He believed that if he worked hard enough, if he stayed focused enough, if he became undeniable, then one day he would finally be seen for his mind instead of the labels others tried to place on him. Numbers had become his refuge. In equations, there was fairness. In logic, there was stability. In mathematics, truth did not bend to bias, but the world outside equations did. And he had known that truth for as long as he could remember. He could feel it sometimes in the smallest interactions, in the way assumptions lingered before acknowledgement, in the way surprise appeared where respect should have been. It wasn't always hostile. It wasn't always spoken. But it lived in the pauses, in the double takes, in the silent measurements others made before deciding how to treat him. And so, as he moved through the quiet hallway that morning, he walked not just with purpose, but with awareness, the awareness of someone who had learned to carry himself carefully, with strength that did not need to announce itself. The hall stretched long before him, a tunnel of polished floors and pale walls reflecting the soft morning light. His footsteps were steady, measured, echoing gently through the stillness. The backpack against his shoulders felt heavier than its contents, because it carried not only his books and notes, but years of effort, expectation, and the constant need to prove that he belonged in every space he entered. The world saw a student on his way to class. He felt a lifetime of perseverance moving forward step by step. There was something grounding about routine, the familiar route, the familiar building, the familiar rhythm of his morning. And yet, beneath that familiarity, a faint tension lingered, something he could not quite name. It was not fear, not worry, but a subtle tightening of instinct, the quiet feeling that today held more weight than the ordinary calm suggested. Experience had taught him to recognize moments like this, moments where stillness did not feel empty but expectant. He did not slow his pace. He did not hesitate, because his life had never allowed room for hesitation. Instead, he carried his composure the way others carried entitlement, not because it was given to him, but because he had earned it. Every space he walked into was a space he had fought to stand in, and every morning like this one was a reminder that his journey had never been easy, but it had always been his. From a distance, the classroom door waited at the end of the hall, ordinary and quiet like any other morning. But somewhere beneath the calm, a shift waited, unseen, unspoken, ready to reveal itself when he stepped inside. He could not predict what waited ahead of him, could not see the challenge already forming in the shadows of authority and expectation. Yet he walked forward with the same steady resolve that had carried him through every barrier before this one. Because even without knowing it, he was already walking toward a moment that would test not just his knowledge but his dignity, a moment where truth, prejudice, brilliance, and injustice would collide in silence. And he was ready not because the world had prepared him to face it, but because his entire life had. When he entered the classroom that morning, everything appeared ordinary. Students shuffled into their seats, notebooks opened, screens lit, the low murmur of tired voices slowly fading into silence. Yet beneath the routine there was a faint shift, something subtle in the atmosphere, something he could not name yet. He took his usual place near the front, not to be seen, but to focus, to drown out distractions and lose himself in the one thing that always made sense. The room held the familiar echo of early classes, the quiet scraping of chairs against the floor, the soft rustling of papers, the rhythmic tapping of fingers on keyboards. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, stretching across the rows of desks in pale lines. To anyone else, this classroom was nothing more than a space for learning, fluorescent lights, pale walls, the scent of dry erase markers and chalk lingering faintly in the air. But for him, every room like this carried more than academic weight. It carried history, a silent reminder of how often he had walked into spaces where expectation followed him before understanding. He organized his notes with calm precision, unaware that the moment waiting ahead would test more than his ability. It would test his patience, his resilience, the strength he had spent a lifetime building in silence. His movements were steady and deliberate, the way a craftsman prepares tools before beginning work. He aligned his notebook, placed his pen beside it, adjusted the strap of his backpack against the side of his chair. These small rituals grounded him, reminded him that discipline was something he could control, even when the world around him was unpredictable. From childhood, he had learned that excellence was not simply a goal, it was a shield. Every late night spent studying, every quiet hour lost in equations, every silent refusal to give up had been a promise to himself. He believed that if he worked hard enough, if he stayed focused enough, if he became undeniable, then one day he would finally be seen for his mind instead of the labels others tried to place on him. Numbers had become his refuge. In equations there was fairness. In logic there was stability. In mathematics, truth did not bend to bias, yet beyond the comfort of formulas, the world did not always follow the same rules. Inside the math building, the air always felt colder, as if the walls themselves guarded an old history he was never meant to forget. Framed portraits of past scholars lined the corridor, rows of faces that rarely looked like his, faces celebrated and preserved, representing a legacy he admired yet felt distanced from. Each day he passed them with a quiet promise that one day he would carve out a place among those who believed he did not belong there. He could still feel that promise echoing inside him as he sat in his chair. He did not come here to challenge anyone. He came here because he belonged here. And yet, belonging in places like this was never something the world handed him freely. It was something he had to carry for himself day after day, step after step, breath after breath. As the murmurs faded and silence settled into the room, he felt that same subtle tension return, a faint shift beneath the surface, like a ripple traveling through still water. He could not explain it, but he could feel it. Experience had sharpened his senses in ways he never asked for. He could sense when a moment carried more weight than it appeared. Today carried that weight. He straightened in his seat, steady but unaware of how deeply this moment would soon press into his life. He did not yet know that the ordinary calm of the classroom would soon fracture, revealing a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. He watched quietly at first, studying the structure, recognizing fragments of advanced concepts, yet noticing how intentionally overwhelming it seemed. It was not a lesson meant for learning. It felt like a performance, one crafted to draw attention, to create a moment, to point toward a target long before the challenge was spoken aloud. The professor moved with practiced authority, pacing at the front of the room with a confidence shaped by years of unchallenged control. Chalk touched the board, lines appeared, symbols stretched across the surface in long, winding patterns, expanding further, deeper, more complex than anything listed in the syllabus. The problem grew larger, heavier, layered with difficulty that seemed less like instruction and more like a spectacle. He could feel the difference. He had seen complex equations before. He had solved problems that pushed the mind to its limits. But this felt different. This felt purposeful in a way that transcended academics, as if the equation was less about mathematics and more about message. As if the board itself was becoming a stage. From the back of the room came faint whispers, not loud, not disruptive, but lingering. Students shifted in their seats, eyes tracing the endless symbols stretching across the board. Some appeared curious, others uneasy. But beneath every reaction lived one unspoken truth: this problem was not meant for understanding, it was meant to overwhelm. He studied each stroke of chalk, following the structure beneath the chaos. The logic existed, buried, tangled, but present. And through that structure he sensed intent. This was not an exercise in learning. This was a demonstration of power, a quiet reminder of who controlled knowledge, of who decided difficulty, of who decided who would rise and who would falter. Yet he did not flinch, he did not shift, he did not shrink. Instead, he focused not on the performance but on the truth beneath it. The equation was not the threat, the meaning behind it was. And he had learned over years of challenge and prejudice that understanding truth beneath intimidation was its own form of strength. The room grew quieter, tension deepened. And somewhere beneath the silence, something else began to move toward him. A moment, a shift, a turning point approaching like an echo before sound. Then he felt it, the shift in the room, eyes turning, not toward the board, toward him. A familiar pressure crept across his chest, one he had known many times before. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't admiration. It was expectation, the kind built from assumption rather than understanding. The problem on the board was no longer just an equation. It was a test, but not an academic one. It was a test of belonging. He knew the feeling too well, the quiet message beneath the gesture, the silent narrative waiting to be confirmed. In that moment, he was no longer a student among students. He was a symbol, an exception people weren't prepared to accept, someone others doubted before he ever spoke. The realization settled deep inside him, heavy but not unfamiliar. He had lived in this moment before, in classrooms where praise came late but doubt arrived early. In spaces where his ability surprised people instead of being expected from him. The equation now stood less like a challenge and more like a mirror reflecting every barrier he had endured just to sit in that chair. He could have stayed seated. He could have avoided the weight, but his life had never allowed room for retreat. Every challenge he had faced before this one had taught him the same lesson: when the world tries to shrink you, you rise not for approval but for yourself. So he stood, not with arrogance, not with defiance, with quiet discipline. The movement was small, only a shift of posture, a rise from his chair, yet it echoed through the room like a spark in silence. The professor paused, the chalk rested midair. Students watched, not loudly, not openly, but with that same silent expectation pressing through the atmosphere. He did not stand to prove anything to them. He stood because he had spent a lifetime rising in moments where the world expected him to fall. And somewhere deep inside, he already understood that this moment would become one of those memories that would follow him long after the chalk had faded from the board. He walked toward the board, each step echoing louder inside his chest than across the room. The symbols towered in front of him, complex, dense, structured like a wall built to intimidate. Behind him, silence spread across the classroom, thick, unblinking, charged with anticipation. Some watched with doubt, some with reluctant fascination, a few with hope they were almost afraid to feel. He picked up the chalk. For a heartbeat, he closed his eyes, grounding himself in the one place no one could touch, the clarity of his own mind. Patterns formed, structures emerged. Beneath the chaos of the problem lay a logic only visible to those willing to look beyond intimidation. Slowly, deliberately, he began to work. Each movement of his hand carried years of discipline. Each line represented countless hours of unseen effort. The more the solution took shape, the heavier the room felt. This moment was no longer about mathematics. It was about truth pushing against bias, brilliance confronting limitation, dignity standing in silence against judgment. Inside, another battle raged. Not against the equation, against the quiet narrative pressing in from all directions. A narrative that had followed him from childhood classrooms to scholarship interviews to every space where excellence was questioned before it was recognized. He could feel it lingering behind his back, the expectation of failure, the readiness to confirm doubt, but his purpose was stronger. He focused deeper, tracing order through complexity, untying the structure one layer at a time. The symbols began to align, the impossible began to unfold into clarity. A faint shift moved through the room, not spoken, not acknowledged, but felt. The moment had begun to change, and yet the tension did not fade. Because this was no longer simply about solving a problem. It was about what the solution would reveal, about what it would force others to confront, not about him, but about themselves. He continued, steady, unshaken, guided by knowledge no prejudice could erase. The structure of the equation unfolded under his hands, complex layers dissolving into clarity that no one could deny. The quiet resistance in the room began to tremble beneath the truth forming line by line. Still, he felt the tension grow stronger, not because the problem resisted him, because the world did. He stood there, one heartbeat away from turning a moment of humiliation into a revelation. A lifetime of doubt had led to this silence, and the silence was on the edge of breaking. He did not rush, he did not try to impress. His movements were precise, patient, almost restrained, as if he carried an understanding that this moment was not simply about reaching an answer, but about moving through every layer of resistance wrapped around it. The chalk rested lightly between his fingers, and every stroke felt deliberate, calm, disciplined, rooted in a strength that had been shaped long before this classroom ever existed. A memory rose quietly in him, not vivid, not loud, but present. The countless moments where he had been measured not by his knowledge but by assumptions about who he was allowed to be, teachers who hesitated to call on him, advisors who suggested he aim lower, strangers who reacted with surprise when he spoke with confidence or insight. These experiences had not broken him, they had trained him, strengthened him, sharpened his resolve into something unmovable. And now, all of that history lived inside his composure. Behind him, he could sense the professor's presence, still, observant, rigid, a force that did not guide knowledge but guarded expectation. The challenge on the board had not been written to inspire growth. It had been placed there to corner him, to turn him into a spectacle, to silently dare him to fail beneath the weight of scrutiny. But instead of shrinking, instead of retreating, he rose with the same grace he had carried through every battle life had demanded of him. He remained grounded, even as the atmosphere tightened. The room felt suspended between two realities, the one built on bias and the one unfolding slowly in chalk and truth. Some students leaned forward in their seats without realizing it, pulled toward a moment that challenged what they thought they understood. Others stiffened, guarded, unwilling to let their beliefs shift, unwilling to allow what they were witnessing to settle into acceptance. But none of them understood what this moment truly meant to him. For them, it was an unusual classroom scene. For him, it was a lifetime condensed into silence. He carried more than intelligence in that moment. He carried perseverance, resilience, dignity, and the unspoken weight of every time brilliance like his had been doubted before it was seen. His breathing stayed slow, steady, even. There was no tremor in his posture, no hesitation in his movement. The discipline that guided him did not come from a desire to prove anyone wrong. It came from a deeper place, the unwavering belief that he had always belonged in spaces like this, no matter how often the world tried to deny it. The chalk paused for a brief second above the board, suspended in stillness, not from uncertainty, not from fear, but from awareness. He understood with absolute clarity that what he was doing in this moment was larger than mathematics. The question stretching across the board was not only academic, it was personal, it was historic, it was systemic. He was no longer responding to a problem, he was responding to a narrative that had followed him his entire life. And still he remained composed, still he remained disciplined, still he moved forward. He did not rise for applause, he did not rise for recognition. He rose for himself, for every version of him who had once doubted whether effort alone would ever be enough, and for every unseen person who carried the same burden in silence. And as he continued writing, the silence around him did not weaken. It deepened, because strength, when it refuses to break, does not calm a room, it exposes it. He stood at the board, the chalk steady between his fingers, the world around him shrinking into a narrow tunnel of silence and pressure. The symbols in front of him stretched outward like branches of a tangled tree, layered and twisted, meant to confuse, meant to overwhelm. Yet beneath the complexity, he could see the hidden rhythm, the quiet logic buried under intimidation. He followed it with patience, tracing through the chaos step by step, carrying years of discipline in every motion. But as the solution slowly began to take shape, the tension in the room deepened instead of easing. It was not the kind of tension born from curiosity or admiration. It was the tightening of fragile ego, the discomfort of expectations collapsing. He could feel it pressing against his back, silent, unspoken, heavy. The challenge on the board was no longer the true obstacle. The real barrier stood behind him, inside the stares, inside the doubt, inside the quiet refusal to believe in the brilliance unfolding before their eyes. The air felt colder, tighter, not because the room had changed, but because the truth within it was shifting. The very act of his success created a rupture in the narrative many had unconsciously relied on, a narrative that placed limits on who could excel, on who could lead, on who could stand before a complex equation and meet it with clarity instead of fear. He could feel it. He could feel the resistance layered inside the silence. And yet, he did not let it enter him. His thoughts drifted for a fleeting second to the path that had brought him here, the early mornings, the sacrifices his family made, the endless nights where his determination became the only thing strong enough to carry him forward. He remembered classrooms where he was treated as an exception rather than a student, achievements greeted not with respect but with surprise. The memory of every moment lingered now, converging into this single point in time. All of it sharpened his focus rather than breaking it. Every line he drew on the board was more than mathematics. It was a refusal to disappear. He moved deeper into the heart of the problem, transforming layers of uncertainty into clarity. Patterns emerged, fragile at first, then solid, guiding him forward. The chalk glided in smooth, deliberate strokes, each answer leading into the next, each transformation pulling the equation back under control. The impossible slowly became structured, recognizable, undeniable, and still no one spoke. The silence folded inward, tight, suffocating, filled with emotion no one dared express. Some students watched with quiet awe, their thoughts shifting, their assumptions unraveling. Others tightened their posture, refusing to accept what was unfolding. Because this moment did not just reveal knowledge, it revealed belief. And belief, when fractured, does not collapse gracefully. It resists. The room had become a mirror not of him, but of them. But even as that truth rippled through the air, he remained grounded, steady, unwavering. Because he had never lived for the comfort of those who underestimated him. He had lived for the truth of who he was and who he would continue to be, with or without their permission. Inside his chest, his heart pounded with steady force. The pressure was immense, but it no longer controlled him. The farther he moved, the clearer the path became, as if the equation itself surrendered to his persistence. Numbers aligned. Variables resolved. Deep structure revealed its order. He was no longer fighting the problem, he was transcending the challenge placed before him. Still, a storm gathered behind him. The air had shifted into something sharp and electric, like the last moment before thunder breaks. He sensed resistance, not from the board but from the authority watching him. This challenge had not been written to be solved. It had been written to expose him, to turn him into a performance, to prove a quiet belief that brilliance did not belong where he stood. Yet instead of failing, he was unraveling the very intention that created the moment. And with every line he completed, the room was forced to face a truth it had never intended to see. His movements grew more confident, not in arrogance but in certainty, the certainty that knowledge, once fully engaged, carries a momentum of its own. His mind sharpened, thoughts flowing in sequence, every layer of the problem folding open like pages in a book he had already learned to read long before anyone assumed he could. He paused briefly, not from confusion but from the weight of realization. This moment was bigger than a classroom, bigger than the challenge, bigger than the professor who believed he could be broken under pressure. It was every moment like it, every time someone like him had been underestimated, challenged unfairly, doubted before being heard. The awareness tightened his breath for a second, then steadied it again. He lifted the chalk and continued. The final layers of the equation began to collapse into form. What once appeared unsolvable now stood on the brink of clarity. Students leaned forward, some in disbelief, others in quiet admiration. The silence thickened into something profound, the kind of stillness that happens when truth approaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. This was the sound of prejudice losing ground, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through undeniable brilliance, and still he did not seek validation, he did not search for approval, he simply finished what he began because success to him was not a performance, it was survival. His mind sharpened, his movements grew more precise, every calculation flowed into the next with unwavering certainty. The once towering barrier had become a path lit from within by knowledge alone, his knowledge, his effort, his endurance. But just as the breakthrough was within reach, the pressure around him surged. It was not fear, it was resistance. The room resisted the truth the same way the world often resisted stories like his. His success did not fit within the expectations silently written for him. Instead of celebration, there was tension. Instead of relief, there was discomfort. He could feel it radiating from behind him, pulsing with frustration, pride, and disbelief. Yet he did not allow that resistance to fracture his focus. He had carried resistance his entire life, and he had learned long ago that pressure does not define strength, response does. He moved toward the final transformation, the last sequence that would bring the equation into balance. The chalk trembled slightly in his hand, not from doubt, from the magnitude of the moment. This was the hinge point, the turning breath, the fragile space between humiliation and revelation. The room felt smaller, yet heavier. Time stretched thin, suspended across a single line of numbers waiting to be completed. He drew closer to the end. His journey, every struggle, every quiet victory, every barrier broken, lived inside this single breath, this final movement. He knew what finishing this meant. It meant exposing not just the bias behind the challenge, but the truth of who he was, who he had always been long before this moment tried to define him. He took a steady breath. The chalk touched the board, and the world around him fell into absolute, unbreakable silence. And with one final, precise motion, he brought the impossible to the edge of becoming undeniable, and in that breathless instant, the entire room hung in silence, standing on the brink of a truth that could no longer be buried. No one moved. No one spoke. The moment existed like a held breath suspended in air, fragile, heavy, waiting to break. Students stared not at the board, but at what the board revealed about themselves. Assumptions cracked quietly beneath the surface. Ego recoiled, reality settled, and he stood there calm, grounded, unbroken, not as a symbol of defiance, but as proof that brilliance does not ask for permission to exist, it simply does. He remained at the board, and as the silence thickened around him, the solution finally began to reveal itself in full structure, not as fragments of scattered logic, but as something whole, something coherent, something undeniable. The lines he had written were no longer isolated steps. They were now woven together into a pattern that carried purpose and clarity, a sequence moving toward completion with a confidence that could no longer be ignored. His expression did not change, no rush of excitement, no visible relief, only a deeper calm, a steadier composure, as though he had expected this clarity to arrive all along. To him, this breakthrough was not a surprise. It was the natural conclusion of effort meeting intention, of skill meeting discipline, of perseverance meeting truth. But to the room behind him, the shift was something different, something unsettling, something that quietly challenged the limits of what they believed they already understood about him. He could feel it without turning around. The stillness behind him had transformed from uncertainty into something sharper, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant recognition. Some students watched the unfolding solution with widening eyes, their thoughts racing, their assumptions unraveling in silence as they compared what they were witnessing with the quiet narratives they had already written in their minds before he ever stood up. Others resisted the realization, clinging to the thin hope that somewhere, somehow, he would fail before reaching the end, that the moment would collapse, that the story would realign itself with the expectations they were more comfortable carrying. But line by line, that hope dissolved. The equation no longer resembled chaos. It now stood as a structure being guided with deliberate precision by someone who understood far more than they had ever imagined. His movements grew steadier as the final pieces formed, but his composure was not fueled by triumph. It was grounded in the same quiet discipline that had always guided him. The breakthrough forming in front of him was not sudden inspiration. It was the result of countless nights spent working in silence, of pushing through doubt, of choosing persistence over exhaustion again and again. Each line of chalk held the weight of years, years of sacrifice, years of resilience, years of proving himself in spaces that had waited for him to fail before allowing themselves to consider the possibility of his success. And even now, as clarity emerged, the room did not soften. The breakthrough did not bring applause. It did not bring admiration. Instead, it exposed the fragile distance between truth and perception, between reality and bias, between who he truly was and who others had assumed him to be. He breathed in slowly, steady, and grounded, aware of the pressure surrounding him but refusing to let it shape his intention. His focus remained fixed on the equation, on the structure, on the logic, on the rhythm of order emerging from confusion. The deeper truth of the moment lived beneath the numbers, but he carried that truth without allowing it to fracture his concentration. The chalk glided forward, and the final layers of complexity loosened as if the problem itself could no longer resist clarity. For a brief second, he could almost feel the shift in the air, not a release, not acceptance, but a recognition that something irreversible was happening, something that could not be reduced, dismissed, or rewritten. The breakthrough was no longer just intellectual. It was human, it was historical, it was deeply, profoundly personal. And as the final structure solidified in front of him, the room was forced to confront the truth rising silently across the board. That brilliance had been present all along, not newly discovered, not unexpectedly revealed, but finally allowed to stand where the world had once tried to deny it. The classroom seemed to narrow into a single point of focus as the final line approached. The chalk hovered only inches away from the last symbol, and time stretched around him like a thin thread pulled to its breaking point. His expression remained calm, but the moment weighed heavily in his chest, not with fear but with understanding. He knew that this final movement was more than a completion. It was a crossing over an invisible line that had been drawn long before he entered the room, long before this equation appeared, long before anyone had spoken his name. The world around him felt suspended, caught between what it had expected to happen and what was now unfolding in undeniable clarity. Behind him, every breath in the room felt louder than sound. No one shifted, no one whispered. No one dared to break the tension that held the space in place. The silence had transformed from doubt into confrontation, not a confrontation directed at him, but one directed inward, inside the people who watched, inside the beliefs they carried, inside the unspoken stories they had accepted without question. The closer he moved toward completion, the more that silence revealed. It uncovered fragility. It exposed discomfort. It forced awareness into places where comfort had once allowed ignorance to remain unchallenged. He did not rush the final steps. His discipline would not allow it. Every choice, every line, every transition was guided with care, not for their approval, not for validation, but for truth itself. His journey had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about honoring the promise he made to himself long before this room existed, the promise to carry his brilliance with dignity, even in spaces that did not expect it, even in spaces that resisted it. His heartbeat pulsed steadily beneath his calm expression, a rhythm that matched the tension pressing against the air. The last remaining transformation sat before him, fragile and powerful at the same time, the thin space where effort met resistance, where knowledge met bias, where reality pressed against the expectations that had tried to confine it. He could feel how deeply the moment extended beyond the chalkboard, into every classroom he had ever stepped into, every doubt he had endured, every silence he had stood inside while others struggled to reconcile his excellence with their assumptions. And yet, he remained centered, he remained grounded, he remained unbroken. The chalk pressed forward again. The final sequence began to close, each symbol falling into place with the inevitability of truth reaching its destination. Some students felt their breath catch in their throats, their minds struggling to process the fullness of what they were witnessing. Others stared rigidly, refusing to let the realization sink in, gripping the last remnants of denial as tightly as the silence gripped the room itself. But nothing could stop what had already taken shape. He moved with unwavering resolve, aware of the moment's weight but refusing to surrender to it. His hand steadied, and in that fragile space between expectation and revelation, between doubt and truth, he understood exactly what this moment meant for him, for every version of him who had once been questioned before being acknowledged. He took one last breath, not to gather courage but to honor the gravity of what was about to be written, and then, without hesitation, he moved toward completion. The chalk touched the board, and with one final, deliberate motion, the last symbol fell into place. The sprawling equation that had once towered above him like an impossible wall now stood complete, precise, ordered, flawless. The chaos had been unraveled, the trap disguised as a challenge had been dismantled, the impossible had been solved. Yet the moment that followed was not filled with relief, it was not filled with admiration. It did not break into applause or praise or recognition. Instead, the room fell into a deeper, heavier silence, not the silence of awe, but the silence of resistance. He could feel it settle across his shoulders like cold weight. Not disbelief, denial, not confusion, refusal. The truth stood clearly written across the board, undeniable in its precision, its logic, its clarity, yet the response was not shaped by the reality of the solution but by the fragility of the expectations it shattered. The problem had never been that the equation was impossible. The problem was that the outcome challenged the quiet story some people had built long before the chalk ever touched the board. He did not smile, he did not triumph. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, feeling every second stretch across the silence like a shadow that would not move. He existed in the truth he had revealed not because the room allowed it, but because the truth no longer needed permission to exist. His brilliance did not rise to demand acknowledgement, it simply remained undeniable. Behind him, emotions collided in silence. Some students stared with shock, their minds struggling to merge what they saw with what they believed. Others felt discomfort ripple through them, a discomfort they did not yet have the language to name, the discomfort of recognizing that prejudice does not always live in loud actions or open hostility. Sometimes, it lives in doubt. In hesitation, in the reluctance to accept brilliance when it arrives from a place they did not expect, and a few quietly, carefully felt something deeper, respect, admiration, a sense of gravity. But even those feelings moved cautiously, trapped beneath the same tension that locked the room in place. He sensed all of it without turning around, because he had felt it before, because he had lived inside that silence his entire life. Success did not always bring acceptance. Sometimes it brought resistance. Sometimes it magnified the discomfort others tried so hard to ignore. Sometimes it revealed the invisible barrier between what people claimed to value and what they were willing to acknowledge when truth appeared in front of them. He remained standing for a moment longer, not in defiance but in quiet strength. The equation stood not as a victory but as a mirror, and the room now had to decide whether to see what was written across it or pretend it was never there at all. He stepped back from the board, but the silence did not loosen. It tightened. It thickened, it wrapped around the room like a cold fog that refused to lift, not one word, not one gesture, not one acknowledgement. The absence of recognition was louder than any accusation could have been. The truth did not fail, it frightened. It unsettled. It exposed something the room had not wanted to confront, that brilliance could exist in a place where bias had quietly assumed it did not belong. The silence spoke its own language, one he had learned long ago. It was the silence reserved for achievements that disrupt expectation. The silence that follows excellence when the world is unprepared to accept the person who carries it. The silence that reveals more about the observers than the one who stands at the center of the moment. He felt it press against his spirit, not as humiliation, but as a deep and unspoken sorrow. A sorrow for every moment like this, every time someone like him had offered brilliance to the world and been met not with recognition, but with restraint. He understood in that painful clarity that this challenge had never been about teaching. It had been about exposure. It had been designed to corner him, to prove a quiet assumption, to remind him that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be someone waiting to measure his worth through doubt instead of respect. And yet, he had risen beyond it. He had not broken, he had not faltered, he had answered injustice not with anger but with excellence, and still the response was silence. His chest did not fill with anger. It filled with something heavier, the weight of understanding. The realization that even when he exceeded every expectation placed in front of him, some systems would still refuse to fully see him. Some people would still cling to disbelief. Some spaces would still treat his success not as a testament to ability, but as an exception they struggled to reconcile with their assumptions. He closed his hand softly around the chalk, then released it, allowing it to rest quietly on the tray beneath the board. The faint sound echoed across the silent room like a closing line in an unfinished story. He did not need applause, he did not seek validation. But he had hoped somewhere deep inside for acknowledgement, for recognition, for the simple dignity of truth being seen instead of resisted. None came, and in that absence, the truth of the room and of the world beyond it revealed itself more clearly than any equation ever could. He turned away from the board and began walking back to his seat, each step carrying both weight and strength, the weight of the silence behind him and the strength of a spirit that refused to bend beneath it. His head remained steady, his posture grounded, his movements calm and controlled, not because the moment had been fair, but because he would not allow its injustice to define him. The silence followed him like a shadow, stretching across the room, pressing into every corner, lingering inside every unspoken thought. He could feel every gaze on his back, some heavy with discomfort, some softened with respect, some frozen in conflicted awareness, yet none of them spoke. He lowered himself into his seat slowly, not in defeat but in dignity. The desk beneath his hands felt familiar, ordinary, grounding, as if reminding him that he had never needed the room's recognition to validate his worth. He had stood before a challenge designed to undermine him, and instead he had turned it into a testament of resilience. The equation remained on the board, bold and unalterable, a silent witness to truth, yet its presence felt fragile against the refusal of the room to acknowledge it. No applause, no praise, no acknowledgement, only truth and the refusal to speak its name. He felt the ache of it not as weakness but as awareness, awareness of how deeply prejudice could hide in silence. Awareness of how effortlessly excellence could be ignored when it did not fit within expectation. Awareness that success, no matter how undeniable, could still be met with resistance instead of recognition. But beneath that ache lived something stronger, a quiet resolve that pulsed through him with every breath. He understood now more clearly than ever that his worth did not exist in their approval. His brilliance did not begin or end with their acknowledgement. His story did not depend on whether others were willing to confront the truth written in front of them. He existed beyond their hesitation, beyond their doubt, beyond their silence. What happened in that classroom was not the collapse of his confidence. It was the sharpening of his purpose. He would carry this moment with him not as a wound but as a revelation. A revelation about the world he moved through, and the strength it would always require to walk through it unchanged. He left the classroom that day with the weight of the moment still clinging to him like a shadow that would not lift. The hallway stretched ahead in a long, quiet corridor, the polished floor reflecting shards of pale light that felt distant and cold. Students passed by in soft clusters, their conversations muted, their footsteps echoing faintly, yet none of it touched him. It was as if he were moving through a world separated by glass, present but untouched, standing beside the rhythm of life rather than inside it. He walked slowly, each step carrying both strength and exhaustion, as though the air around him had grown heavier and the world had shifted into something he recognized more deeply than before, something that could never fully return to what it once seemed. The memory of the board, the silence, the tension, it traveled with him not as a sharp pain but as a deep and unshakable truth carved into the center of his chest. It did not burn, it did not fade. It existed like a quiet echo of every moment that had come before it, every room where doubt had walked beside him, every space where excellence had been questioned before it was acknowledged. And yet, even beneath the ache there was dignity in his steps, a dignity no one could strip from him, not with silence, not with doubt, not with the weight of expectations that tried to contain his brilliance. The hallway lights glowed softly overhead, their reflections stretching across the floor like thin lines guiding his path forward. His hand brushed against the strap of his worn backpack, grounding him in the presence of who he truly was, a student built from effort, sacrifice, and discipline, not from the judgments others carried. He did not rush, he did not look back at the classroom door. The moment was behind him, but its truth remained with him, and he carried it not as defeat but as awareness. Because this was never just about one equation, one classroom, or one silent room. It was about the reality he had learned to navigate his entire life. And as he moved through the long corridor, the world felt wider and heavier and clearer than ever before. In the days that followed, life continued, at least on the surface. Classes resumed, assignments appeared, deadlines crept back into focus, and the rhythm of the campus moved forward as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Conversations drifted through courtyards, lectures filled with routine words, and the world continued turning with quiet indifference. But beneath that rhythm, something lingered, something unspoken, something layered and unresolved, echoing softly beneath the normality everyone pretended to accept. For him, the experience did not dissolve into ordinary memory. It settled into the deeper spaces of his mind. Late at night, as he sat at his desk beneath the soft glow of a small lamp, pages of equations open before him, the silence of that day felt louder than ever. The numbers on the page remained steady, logical, structured, but his thoughts drifted to the stillness of the room after he finished the problem, the way the truth on the board had stood untouched while acknowledgement refused to exist. He remembered every breath of that silence not as failure but as revelation, a revelation that brilliance could illuminate prejudice rather than erase it, that success could expose bias rather than remove it. There were moments when the ache of that truth washed gently through him, not as weakness but as reflection. He thought of the years he had believed that excellence would bridge every distance between effort and recognition. Yet that day had shown him something far more complex, that there are barriers built not from ability but from perception, rooted in histories that linger quietly beneath modern spaces. But alongside the ache, something stronger began to form. A deeper resolve, quiet, steady, and unshakable. He understood now that his journey was not simply personal achievement, it was survival, it was resilience. It was existence in spaces that were not always prepared to fully see him, even when the truth was written clearly in front of them. Over time, the moment did not disappear, it became a reference point, a quiet turning place within him where illusion gave way to clarity. He moved through the world with sharpened awareness, carrying not bitterness but understanding. The weight he carried was no longer only the burden of expectation. It was also the knowledge of his own endurance, the strength of having stood inside silence and remained unbroken. When he stood at the window in the fading evening light, the soft glow tracing the edges of his face, he felt both the ache of injustice and the power of resilience living side by side within him. His reflection stared back, not as someone wounded by the moment, but as someone shaped by it, someone who now understood the quiet truth of his existence more deeply than before. He realized that his presence in these spaces was powerful not because others chose to acknowledge it, but because he continued to exist fully, even when acknowledgement was withheld. His journey became something larger than himself. It echoed beyond classrooms, beyond equations, beyond silence. It spoke for every person who had ever carried excellence without recognition, who had ever stood in rooms where their brilliance was seen but not celebrated, understood but not embraced, proven but still questioned. His story became a mirror, one that revealed the distance between merit and acceptance, between truth and perception, between brilliance and the quiet refusal to see it. And yet, within that reflection, there also lived hope. Hope not born from naivety but from perseverance, from the understanding that every day he chose to continue forward, he was refusing to disappear. He walked across campus with a new kind of strength, not loud, not defiant, but steady and grounded. His posture spoke of endurance, his steps carried purpose. He no longer moved through the world seeking permission to belong. He walked with the certainty that he had earned every inch of the ground beneath his feet. His dreams no longer existed in the fragile space between validation and doubt. They existed within him, anchored in belief, rooted in resilience, strengthened by every barrier he had already survived. The world around him still held bias, still carried hesitation, still placed silent doubts in the shadows of expectation. But he no longer shaped himself around those boundaries. He no longer gave his worth over to the silence of others. Instead, he walked forward with quiet confidence, not to prove anything, but to live fully, to continue becoming everything he already knew himself to be. His journey was no longer about erasing prejudice. It was about refusing to be diminished by it. And with every step he took, he carried not only his own story but the weight and strength of countless others who walked the same unseen road. Long after the chalk had faded from the board, long after the room had emptied and the moment had transformed into memory, its impact remained. It lived in every student who saw themselves in his story. It lived in every heart that felt the weight of that silence. It lived in every mind that was forced to confront a truth it had tried to ignore. Because this was never just one story, It was part of a much larger one, a continuing story of resilience beneath pressure, of injustice revealed in quiet spaces, of brilliance standing tall even when acknowledgement is withheld. His experience became a question that did not fade. It lingered in the spaces between words, in the pause before judgment, in the silence after success. It asked the world to look at itself and to choose. How many more moments like this must unfold before brilliance is recognized without hesitation? How many more stories like his must be lived before we finally choose to change the world that allows them to happen? And in that lingering question, his story continues. Not as a wound, but as a call, as a truth, as a quiet, unbreakable testimony to dignity, endurance, and the human spirit that refuses to disappear.